The Jets need to upgrade their roster in free agency, but they also need to take care of some of their own players. Today, I'll tell you the free agents the Jets cannot afford to lose on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, February 28th, the final day of February. Spring's right around the corner, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source and enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Well, free agency is just a couple of weeks away in the NFL, and there's a lot of speculation about what players from other teams the Jets may sign, but they've got some players of their own who are about to hit free agency, who they really cannot afford to lose. And today we're going to talk about some of the Jets' free agents to be who they should look to re-sign. And I'm going to begin at the center position. And this is a situation that has been confounding me for close to a year, because Connor McGovern is about to hit free agency. He's been the center for the Jets the last 3 years. He's been durable. He's missed only 2 games. And he has provided stability at a position where the Jets had lacked stability since Nick Mangold retired. And the Jets had a golden age of center play, beginning in 1998 when they signed Kevin Mawai away from Seattle. And Mawai finally left the team after the 2005 season. And in the first round of the 2006 draft, the Jets drafted Nick Mangold. And if you go back past Mawai, if you go deeper into Jets history, center's traditionally been a strong position for the New York Jets. And there have been some really rough days for this franchise, but frequently they've had a very good center. That was one tremendous stretch, though, between 1998 and 2016, where you had all of those years, almost 2 decades, where you either had Kevin Mawai, a Hall of Famer, or Nick Mangold, maybe not quite a Hall of Famer, but a guy who was always at the top of the profession. Guys who you just never had to worry about the center position. And then Nick Mangold retired, and we went into a dark age of Jets center play because they went with Wesley Johnson, and he was awful. Then they went to Spencer Long, who you may remember if you were a fan back in 2018, had trouble snapping the ball. Then they went with Ryan Khalil. They dragged Ryan Khalil out of retirement in 2019. And don't listen to any of my podcasts when the Jets signed Khalil, because I was praising the move at the time. Did not work out at all. Khalil was really kind of finished. They got him out of retirement. Khalil really had not prepared for the 19 season, and it was a disaster. And then sprinkled in all these years, they had Jonathan Harrison, who was a backup and not a very good backup at that. Finally, in 2020, the Jets got Connor McGovern. And if you were a longtime listener of this podcast, this podcast began in 2016, so it was Mangold's last season, although he was injured for quite a bit that year. The early years of this podcast, a common theme was me complaining about the Jets at the center position because it was having a very negative impact on this offense. Now, the center position, I think you could actually argue since the days of Mawai, maybe is a little bit less important than it used to be, because when the Jets signed Mawai, they signed it, and Bill Parcells was the Jets head coach and GM at the time, and he said that the biggest reason he signed Mawai was because Buffalo had a nose tackle, Ted Washington, and he wanted to counter Ted Washington. Ted Washington was a heck of a nose tackle back in his day. The dominant defense of the NFL in the years to come became the 3-4 defense, where you had a big 300, 320, 330-pound nose tackle lining up directly over the center, ready to hit him at the snap. That was a critical position. Today's NFL, the game is moved more and more towards offenses revolving around the pass. And because offenses have revolved more around the pass than they did, 20, 30 years ago, the big space-eating nose tackle has not gone out of existence, but is not as prevalent because the big space-eating nose tackle really, more than anything, helped you against the run. He ate up blockers and kept his linebackers clean and allowed his linebackers to get downhill and make plays. Today's game is about getting to the quarterback. So you want your defensive linemen typically to get up the field, to penetrate, to get after the quarterback. You don't have guys line up as frequently over the center. But center's still really important. And it's been particularly important for the Jets over the last couple of years, because the Jets have had a lot of young quarterbacks. And when you are lining up, you essentially have a tandem. The quarterback and the center work hand in hand together, and they kind of try and decipher what the defense is going to do, how you block them, what the blocking assignment should be. You essentially pre-snap need to figure out who's blitzing, who's not, or in the run game you need to figure out assignments based on the way the defense is lined up and based on the way guys are going to move after the snap. It's not so easy. And when you have a young, inexperienced quarterback, a lot more falls to the center. And I know the Jets have not had very good offenses in recent years, so I guess you could argue how important has it been that Connor McGovern has gone out there and played effectively. But I think he's been a big help for the Jets. I think he's been a reliable guy at the center position. And look, all you need to do is look to the 2022 season. The Jets did not have a lot of reliability on the offensive line this year. And part of that was not anybody's fault. It was just a lot of guys got injured. McGovern is a guy who barely missed a snap in his 3 years with the Jets and provided the team quality play. And I just look back, I think about watching the film in 17 and watching the film in 18 and watching the film in 19. It was ugly at the center position. I mean, a center should not impact the team as much as those guys did that the Jets were running out there. Those guys, I'm not going to say they single-handedly destroyed the offense, but if you were making a list of problems on offense, center would be near the top. And this is why it's really puzzling to me that the Jets have not made any sort of efforts to re-sign Connor McGovern. And I'm not, Connor McGovern said that. He actually spoke on the record to the media a few weeks back. He was asked by a reporter whether there had been any contract and any progress on a contract with the Jets, and he said no. They hadn't shown a lot of interest. So I don't get, sometimes you don't hear about these things. Sometimes things are happening behind the scenes, and maybe that's happening now, because again, he said that a few weeks ago, so maybe something's moved since then, but I've really struggled to understand why the Jets have not been more proactive in locking McGovern up, because if you look this year, it's not like there's a ton of quality options available at the center position. There's not in free agency. In fact, you could make an argument McGovern's the best guy out there in free agency. If not, he's number 2. And the Jets are not a team with a tremendous amount of cap space. You've got a guy in hand who can play the position effectively. You might want to lock him up. But the Jets have shown very little interest in this. It's interesting because this was one of Joe Douglas's first big signings, because Joe Douglas did not run the Jets in the 19 offseason. That was Mike McCagnon's final offseason. And then essentially after all the work for the offseason was done, the Jets fired him and Douglas came in. And Douglas's first free agency, the Jets picked their spots here or there. Douglas overall, his body of work in free agency has been bad. I mean, I don't think you can give Joe Douglas a good grade for what he's done in free agency to this point, but one of the most successful signings, in fact, I think outside of DJ Reed, probably the most successful signing he's had has been Connor McGovern. So I look at this and I really don't understand why the Jets aren't making more of an effort to keep him around. And I guess they probably moving in the direction of getting more of a veteran quarterback in here. So maybe from that sense, it's a little bit less important to have a guy making the calls at the center position, but they need the quality player there. And I don't know that you can count on drafting somebody day 2, day 3, because they're not picking a center at 13. I don't know that you can count on a day 2, day 3 pick and just think that guy's a lock to go in there and play well immediately. I think the Jets, this should be like at the top of the priority list. I mean, outside of quarterback, McGovern, getting this guy under contract again would be at the top of my list, and it seems like there's just no urgency. It seems like they don't really care that much about it. I don't really understand it. I hope things change, and maybe sometime in the next couple of weeks I'll be pleased because the Jets will have addressed the center position. I don't want to go back to the days where I'm spending podcast episodes complaining about what the Jets did at center. So Jets, please make this happen. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to a restricted free agent. He's a guy who the Jets acquired in 2020. It was not a very good draft class, but there was one major success story in undrafted free agency this year, and he's really helped the Jets pass rush. I'll tell you who it is and why the Jets should keep him as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want to deal with all the fat and calories? Then you've got to try Built Bars. What makes Built Bar so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. And I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. Most of them only have 130 calories and 4 grams of sugar and 17 grams of protein. Getting a Built Bar would be like the Jets re-signing Connor McGovern. I tell you, it's a great thing when it happens to you. And for years, we've been telling you about how you can order your Built Bars at Built.com. Well, you can still do that, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. So if you head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with their hit flavors brownie batter and churro. You can thank me later, and you can still order your Built Bars at Built.com. Built Bars, absolutely delicious protein bars that taste like candy bars. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. Today we're talking free agents the Jets cannot afford to lose. We've talked about Connor McGovern. Now I'm going to talk about a rotational guy on the defensive side of the ball. And if you're a Jets fan, I don't need to tell you, the 2020 draft class did not work out the way this team was hoping for. It's close to a gutter ball. Mekhi Becton had a decent rookie season and then has barely seen the field since. Denzel Mims, flashed a little bit in the second half of his rookie season and really has not made any sort of impact since. Ashton Davis doesn't look like a player. Jabari Zuniga's gone. James Morgan's gone. Cameron Clark, unfortunately, had to retire. That was just a tough break for the Jets. But you can go down the list. You can talk about Bryce Hall, who had a decent season as a 5th-round pick out of Virginia at the corner position, but was kind of supplanted when the Jets signed DJ Reed and drafted Sauce Gardner. And Braden Mann, the punter, that's just not gone very effectively. The one guy who's been a success was actually an undrafted free agent, and that's Bryce Huff. And here's an amazing stat for Bryce Huff. And now these are difficult to compile, but there are a couple different spots where you can find pressure stats, quarterback hit stats. Bryce Huff in 2022 averaged a disruption, so that could be a hit, it could be a pressure, it could be a sack. About 20% of the time he rushed the passer. That's outstanding. You may not know what those numbers are, but the guys who are at the top of the league are not at 20. They're lower than that. That's like elite level stuff. There's a catch though. The Jets really only played him as a part-time player, and he did not see a ton of snaps. And what's particularly interesting is the Jets really focused on obvious passing downs. How much did they focus on it? Well, over 90% of the time Bryce Huff was on the field was the other team passed the football. That's a pretty incredible stat. So the Jets really used him specifically as a specialist. So that does factor into the numbers. It's a little bit easier when you don't need to protect against the run. Most of the time when the ball is snapped, you have a run assignment. You're assigned a gap. A gap is the spot between one block or another. So it could be a gap could be the area between a center and a guard and a tackle, a tight end, or it could be between a blocker and the end of the line, a tackle and the end of the line, or tight end and the end of the line. When you don't have to secure your gap, you don't have to worry about the other team running the ball. You can just fire up the field off the ball. That said, Bryce Huff's numbers, 20% of the time you're generating some sort of disruption, whether it's a pressure, whether it's a quarterback hit, whether it's a sack. That's pretty good. That's really good. Again, that's top of the league level stuff. In a limited amount of time, albeit in a favorable situation, but still, production's production. Jets have had plenty of guys come through this team through the years who played exclusively on passing downs. Not many were generating pressure rates around 20% of the time. To me, Bryce Huff's the type of guy where you might be able to lock him up on a relatively longer-term deal, and I'm talking maybe like a 3-year deal. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, he's what's known as a restricted free agent, so the Jets do have some rights with him. The way restricted free agency works, if you're not familiar with it, this only applies to players who have exactly 3 years of service time in the NFL. If you have 4 years, then you're an unrestricted free agent. You can sign with whoever you want. If you have 1 or 2 years and your contract expires, you're what's known as a restricted rights free agent, which essentially means that you either play for your team if they offer you a contract or you don't play in the league. What happens with a restricted free agent is the Jets, first of all, will offer him a 1-year contract. He could sign the 1-year contract, and then he stays here for another year, and then next year he'll have 4 years of service time, and he could become an unrestricted free agent. However, he is free to seek other offers from other teams, and he's free to sign with other teams. However, the Jets can match whatever offer another team gives him. And the way the way this works out most of the time is the player just signs the 1-year contract, because there can be draft pick compensation if he signs with another team and the Jets let him go. So this means that a lot of teams just don't want to sign restricted free agents because they frequently have to give up a draft pick to sign them if they get to keep them. And sometimes draft pick compensation is involved. If you get a restricted free agent, you have to give a draft pick to the team he came from. So most of the time what happens is the player signs the 1-year contract and then plays another year. And next year he'll have 4 years of service time, and he can just sign wherever he wants when he becomes an unrestricted free agent. So the Jets essentially have Bryce Huff under their control for 1 more year. Bryce Huff, again, was an undrafted free agent signing. He really has not made much money. Those salaries you get as an undrafted free agent, not very high. And he's the type of guy, he's a good player. Listen, I gave you the numbers. 20% of the time he's getting to the quarterback. But he's not a big name. And he's 1 bad year away from maybe not having a ton of value. So all of these things kind of add up. And they put you in a spot where Bryce Huff, a guy who has not made a lot of money, whose value is contingent on having another big year in 2023, maybe he's willing to take a deal. This could be the kind of guy who's willing to work out something with the Jets longer term, like a 3-year deal at a reasonable rate, and in exchange for financial security, maybe he leaves a little money on the table. He can get the kind of money that sets himself up for life, but maybe a below market value contract. That's something that could really work for the Jets. And another thing I look at is the situation with Carl Lawson, where Carl Lawson is a good player, but he's going to make $15 million next year. And the question is, would you rather have Carl Lawson at $15 million? Well, can you replace him with some sort of combination of Jermaine Johnson, Bryce Huff, and Michael Clemens, making maybe 1/3 of that, or around that neighborhood? Another thing I look at is, people have said, why don't the Jets play Bryce Huff more on early downs when the other team's willing to run the ball? And the response I've always given is that, he's probably not that good against the run. That said, when he's playing against the pass 90% of the time, we don't really know how he could do against the run. Now, I know the coaching staff sees him every day in practice, so that could factor into it, but, who knows? I think he's earned the right to see more playing time and see what he could do, and it's not like Lawson's a great run defender. He does not have a track record for being a very good run defender in his years in the NFL, so I think Bryce Huff's the kind of guy who could take up some of Lawson's snaps, and a guy who could go a long way towards replacing Lawson based on what he's done so far in his brief career with the Jets. To me, there's no excuse for Bryce Huff not being back next year. This is a homegrown talent, a guy who's gotten better every year he's been in the league. This is exactly the kind of guy you should look to keep around. This is exactly the kind of guy you should look to make a Jet over the long run. I'd be very upset if the Jets let Bryce Huff go. In addition to this, we know how Robert Saleh likes to rotate defensive linemen. You got a guy who can get to the quarterback at this rate, you got to bring him back. This one would bother me. It would probably bother me more than it should because he is a rotational player and he has been a part-time player for the Jets. But to me, this is a guy, you got to re-sign this guy. If you don't re-sign this guy, I don't know what you're doing because he's not going to be that expensive. You can bring him back on the 1-year contract, of course, which I think is the most likely scenario. But if you can get him here for 3 to 4 years, I think you should do it because, again, he's probably going to be willing to leave some money on the table for financial security. This is a spot where the Jets have leverage, and if they use it, I think they could get a good deal out of Bryce Huff. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out our show. I've talked about a couple of players so far. I think the Jets need to resign. One's on offense, one's on defense. The third is on special teams, and he's a guy who's filled a role that has plagued the Jets for a number of years. He finally brought stability to the place kicker role. Greg Zuerlein. Jets, bring him back. I'll explain why as we continue this Tuesday episode of the podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday, talking about free agents the Jets should bring back. The Jets need to improve their roster. They're going to have to sign guys from other teams, but they don't want to decrease their own talent level by letting key guys walk away. I've talked about Connor McGovern. I've talked about Bryce Huff. I'm going to talk about Greg Zuerlein right now. I told you earlier in the show about how the first couple of years of this podcast, a common theme was me being irritated that the Jets could not figure out the center position. Well, the last couple of years, my irritation has moved to the kicker role. because the Jets let Jason Myers go after the 2018 season. Seattle gave him a big contract, a contract that, was not been that really was not a very good contract for Seattle, although Myers has had a couple of good years. He's also had some shaky years. He even had one outright bad year. It should not be that hard to replace a kicker. And people disagree with me on this. And listen, I try and be open-minded about things. I try and respect all opinions. You're wrong about that, though, if you feel that way. It's not that hard to find a kicker in this league. And for whatever reason, Joe Douglas has just refused to follow some very basic steps that any GM should be able to follow to find a kicker. Joe Douglas, the first couple of years, his first 3 years with the Jets, went out and just found the biggest legged guy he could get, the guy who could kick the ball the furthest, and he really did not care about accuracy. And Joe Douglas's first game as Jets GM, they had a guy, Kari Vedvik, who contributed to it wasn't all Kari Vedvik's fault, but missed an extra point, missed a short field goal, and the Jets lost to Buffalo. A game the Jets lost by, I think it was a point. So Kari Vedvik certainly hurt the Jets in that game. Now, a lot of that was Adam Gase being outcoached by Sean McDermott. There were some other issues in that game for the Jets, but that's how we began Joe Douglas's tenure. And he kept bringing in guys who really had no track record in the league. And the thing that drives you crazy is that at any given point in time, there are a couple of guys that teams signed off the scrap heap. There's always a kicker out there who can go out and do the job effectively. There's always some kicker who's got experience in the league, who's shown you a track record that they can do the job well. And Joe Douglas has just refused to get that guy until he signed Greg Zuerlein last offseason. And I think it was maybe it was some sort of compromise with Douglas, because Greg has a big leg. His nickname is Greg the Leg. And of course, if you remember, he kicked he had an absolute he had a very long field goal in the 2018 NFC Championship game in New Orleans indoors, but an overtime field goal, a long field goal from beyond 55 that put the Rams into the Super Bowl that year, and became a free agent last year, and the Jets brought him in, and he did a good job stabilizing the position. In fact, I think if you look at Greg Zuerlein's numbers, they probably don't do justice to how good he was, because the Jets also tried a lot of long field goals with him because his leg is so big. Listen, this one is simple for me. I mean, if you got a kicker who could do the job effectively, you keep him. It's really, unless somebody gives you a crazy contract, unless somebody goes out and gives Greg Zuerlein like a $6 million a year contract, and sometimes that happens, and giving kickers a ton of money is kind of silly, because again, there's always a guy out there who's available off the scrap heap at any given point in time who can go out and do the job effectively. But I also I'm also not a believer in nickel and diming it if you've got a guy who can do who you can trust, a guy who can kick effectively. And that's what Greg Zuerlein is. He came in, and I shouldn't say that because at the end of the 21 season, the Jets did bring in Eddie Pinheiro, who I referred to as my favorite player at the time, because he also did very well for the Jets. But Zuerlein supplanted Eddie. I think it was because Zuerlein had the bigger leg and showed a capability of doing it. Zuerlein can kick touchbacks. He can kick in bad weather. He can hit long field goals if you're down near the end of the game, although he did miss one against Detroit. He brings what you want from the kicker spots. I mean, I think that there are like 3 types of kickers in this league. There's like the Justin Tucker, where he's automatic. He's the greatest kicker ever. He's a guy who actually makes the difference. Or not the greatest. He's the greatest kicker of his era. Maybe not the greatest kicker ever, but guy who legitimately makes a difference. And I think that's a category of one. I think back when he was playing, Adam Vinatieri also would have fit that category. The difference-making kickers. Not many of them out there. If you get one, you hold on to him. That's the one type of kicker I wouldn't mind paying. You give Justin Tucker's probably worth whatever you give him. Adam Vinatieri back in his day was probably worth whatever you give him. Then in the middle, you have guys who are just competent kickers, guys who are nothing special. They could have a good year, they could have a bad year. If you have one and he's not asking for crazy money, you keep him, because you don't want to mess around with it if you can afford it. If somebody gives him a crazy contract, then you take your chances, and you should be able to find a replacement. And then you have your guys like Joe Douglas, who brought it in for years, who just can't kick at all. You're trying to develop some guy with a big leg. Thankfully, we've moved into the second category. After 2.5 years of being in the third category, we've moved into the second category. Eddie Pinheiro brought us to Greg Zuerlein. Jets, re-sign Greg Zuerlein. It's that simple, please. Jets, please re-sign Connor McGovern. Give Bryce Huff a multi-year contract. bring back Greg Zuerlein on a reasonable deal. This is simple. Then we can focus. Then we can play offense. Then we can try and improve the team. But bring these three guys back. Don't weaken spots where you have effective players. That's my simple request for you today, New York Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will do our weekly Wednesday mailbag.